World leaders from many countries have already begun arriving in Beijing ahead of the Belt and Road Forum. Representatives from over 130 countries are due to take part, with President Xi set to deliver an opening speech. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who will be attending, earlier called Beijing's initiative a perfect match with Russia's vision for regional development.
Да, мы видим, что кто-то воспринимает ее как попытку Китайской Народной Республики кого-то под себя подмять, но мы не видим этого. Мы видим просто желание к сотрудничеству. Поэтому мы приветствуем вот эту инициативу председателя Си Цзиньпиня. Вместе работаем и готовы, и будем работать дальше. И наши вот собственные идеи по поводу развития Евразийского экономического союза, например, строительства Большой Евразии, они полностью совпадают с китайскими идеями в рамках предложенного сотрудничества «Один пояс, один путь».
All right, let's get some insight from Chong Ja Ian, Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore. We're also joined by Frank Lavin from the Hoover Institution. Frank served as Undersecretary for International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Professor, thanks for coming into studio this morning. Let's start with you. You know, at this point, the BRI has become much more than just about economics, right? Can you talk us through what it means for China's political and security agenda and how it's evolved over the past 10 years?
That's kind of a big range of things to cover. But essentially, one of the things with the Belt and Road is that it diversifies China's sources of routes for trade and for energy imports, so that relieves some of the pressure and the dependence on the maritime routes that will go through the disputed South China Sea and what some would see as a choke point in the Strait of Malacca. So that reduces some of the, I think, concerns for China about having an over concentration of their trading through Southeast Asia. On the other hand, I think for the PRC, the ability to disperse funds, controversial as that may be, has allowed them to gain quite a lot of traction, especially in developing parts of the world. So that's really, I think, increased China's clout internationally.
Well, Dr. Chong, Professor Chong, I want to ask you something. This is the decade anniversary, after all, of the BRI. Do you agree with the assessment then that it has lost steam? Did it achieve that one-two punch of, developing global infrastructure, reroute trade, as well as gain political clout?
Well, like many of these projects, what turns out in the end is not always going to be what was initially advertised. That is the same thing for the BRI as it would be for many other major infrastructure projects, because infrastructure is hard. To really put a lot of money into places that are less developed, where governance structures are a bit weaker, that's pretty risky. And what that means is there will be issues with how debt is structured. There will be issues of environmental impact. There will be issues of social pushback. The BRI has expectedly actually run into all these things. But what's interesting is, like many other great powers, China had this sort of idea that, it could sort of change the world. So that, of course, meets reality, just like Soviet projects before it, US projects before it. And so that it's a sort of, I guess, return to the norm. So China has gained influence, to be sure, but it's not, the kind of unmitigated good that I think Xi Jinping initially touted the project to be.
Frank, let's bring you into this conversation. The BRI, it's seen its fair share of controversies. There's labor exploitation, also corruption, with one report saying 35% of projects are struggling with corruption. At this point, what would you see as the biggest challenges, the biggest failures for the BRI?
Thank you for having me on. I think I found myself in general agreement with Professor Chong's overall comments that, in general, this has been a successful initiative, but there are certainly elements of it which have not been successful or fallen short. And as he noted, one of the challenges with infrastructure is you're placing a bet. You're placing a 10 or 20-year bet. And infrastructure projects tend to overshoot. They tend to come to fruition when there's a very high rate of growth, and the premise tends to be, well, this growth will continue. So if growth falters a bit, as we've seen in Pakistan, as we've seen in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, then we have too much infrastructure, we have too much debt. So there's going to be places where there is a mismatch between the nature of the project and the debt service and the economic utility of the project. There's just a mismatch, and the related parties all have to come to terms with that. But in general, I'd say as a diplomatic initiative and as a build-out initiative and as a way of improving the conversation with its near abroad and even not so near abroad, it's been a strong diplomatic success.
Well, Frank, debt trap diplomacy continues to dominate discussion. This is coming quite a lot from the West. Is this fair criticism of the entire BRI project?
Well, I think there are at least there are several places where it is very fair criticism. And by the way, I don't think debt trap diplomacy is probably not a fair terminology in the sense that I don't think it was designed to be a debt trap. I don't think that was the purpose of it. But if the party giving the loan overshoots and the party receiving the money willingly complies with it, then you end up with too much debt and you end up with infrastructure that isn't used. So you could easily have a country participate in Belt and Road Initiative that has plans to improve international airport capacity 50%, which at the time of that decision made a lot of sense. But if the economy softens or tourism softens because of COVID, we say, you know what, international air traffic isn't really going up at all. And now we've taken on the debt to build out our airport 50%. So somebody's got to come to terms with this mismatch between what we're doing and what we really need. And so, but I wouldn't say trap is really a loaded word because it implies that from the start, from the get-go, China was trying to trick these. I don't think that was the case at all. I think it was basically good faith efforts, but the market shifted or the projections were just too robust than what was really needed.
Professor, what about you? Because that descriptor, the debt trap, would you agree with that, or would you agree with what Frank is saying?
So again, I'm broadly in agreement with what Frank had said. I think you also have to look at the kinds of deals that were entered into. I think I don't think it was a sort of intention on the side of Beijing to sort of trick or to hoodwink local actors, but I do think that there was a lot of over-optimism. I think that some of the expectations about how the loans will be serviced, about the returns on these investments were done in a way that perhaps could have had more due diligence. I mean, one of the things that Beijing did when it pushed out the Belt and Road was to talk about how its approach would be no strings attached, meaning to say that they would have fewer requirements on some of these governance and due diligence issues. But those things are in place for a reason. Why many international donors, whether it's international organizations or states, have them is because experience has shown that, even when you have these things in place, it's a highly risky proposition when you have major infrastructure investment. So you have these things in place as sort of guardrails to make sure that things are more manageable, that you make sure that the sort of social and economic pushback, if things go south, are better handled. The fact that Beijing was more, I think, lax about these issues have meant that you do get, debt issues, whether you're looking at Sri Lanka or whether you're looking at Pakistan, or sometimes when it comes to interest, right? When you look at the way that the Thai high-speed rail has developed.
Prof, over the years, we've also seen China shift its focus from those multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects to what it calls smaller, greener projects. So as a signal, of course, it's moved to, being sort of like taking part in projects that are more attainable, and then will it water down China's global outreach and how much the BRI was actually supposed to contribute to global economies?
So these smaller projects are, I think, a lot more manageable and digestible by host countries. And at the same time, I think that what they do is also to build out certain things that host countries need, such as when you look at digital infrastructure. But they don't give you that big sort of sticker of a major railway. They don't look as physical, so they're more manageable. They, I suppose, more consistent with the needs of various host states. They're also more consistent with what China's able to do as its economy is coming under pressure. But they have less of a sort of public outreach sort of value as opposed to a big port or a big airport or a big railway.
Frank, if we look at the 100 plus countries involved in the BRI, many of them are some of the poorest countries in the world. How far would you say this initiative has gone to unite the global South?
I think that's probably an overstatement. I think it's going to be case specific, meaning there are definitely going to be countries that benefit from a new railway or airport improvements or a hydroelectric facility, and that's enormously helpful to them if it's done right. But I think it's another thing altogether to say this creates some kind of regional political bond or regional identity. I think it's a useful opening for Chinese diplomacy. I think it enhances relationship. It improves the conversation from Beijing's point of view. But I don't think it necessarily creates a regional consciousness or regional desire to work together. And I think, as the professor alluded, there can even be some negative elements of this. I was just reflecting on the Chinese proposal to reshape the Mekong, the upper Mekong, for cargo ships from China into Thailand, which, in the abstract, in a purely economic sense, has an appeal that if you can improve river navigation. But what happened was there were considerable environmental dimension to this, dynamiting and reshaping the river, and there were also ecological dimension to it, and then social dimension, because you had local fishermen and local livestock and so forth are all affected by it. And the Thai government eventually had to pull back from it, so it couldn't go ahead. So taking these local sensitivities into account is also an important element of development.
I do appreciate, gentlemen, for joining us this morning, talking about BRI 10 years since the start. We were speaking to Dr. Chong Ja Ian, the Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore, and Frank Lavin, Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution.